Hello, hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous Patreons and channel members. You are the reason why this content remains somewhat reasonable. Wow, that's the best I got today? Oh boy, I should probably be thinking of these way in advance. I literally wait until the last minute to actually come up with that off the top of my head, and tonight the old brain's just not working for me, but that's okay, because today we have a bit of a slightly newer topic, but not unfamiliar: steam explosions. We've talked about them before on several instances, and tonight we are going to discuss what is, in fact, as far as I know, the worst steam explosion in history in terms of death toll. So, bit of a dark topic, I know. But hey, sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes people ask me to talk about this kind of stuff, so I'm going to give it a shot. And as the background footage may suggest, you may notice that this is in fact not regarding a steam locomotive. It is in fact regarding a steamboat. This is the story of the Steamboat Sultana disaster. I suppose it's relatively easy to understand why a steam explosion involving a boat might be a little more cataclysmic in terms of loss of life when compared to a locomotive. Locomotives, if something does go wrong, are usually far away from most, people that might be in the way beyond the crew, of course. Even on a passenger train, there's still several lines of defense in the event of an explosion. And to be honest, most steam explosions, when it comes to locomotives, happen on very heavy freight trains, resulting in the crews often taxing the locomotive more than they should have. Whereas passenger trains, by comparison, are often much lighter, and therefore the locomotives don't usually get put in a position where they would be at risk of exploding. But on a boat, the situation is completely different. For one thing, the boilers used in the steam engines, and often there are more than one on larger boats, are generally fixated low and in the center of the boat in question. This makes sense just from the weight distribution. You don't want to put your heavy engine components high on a boat because that'll make it top heavy. You want it low and towards the center to even out the balancing act you got going on whenever you're floating on water. But because it's a boat, and on passenger boats people are just on it, it means that if something does go wrong, the explosion is centralized and people are right next to the inherent danger. I often find it humorous that people will call these types of boats steamboats, because yes, we have a classic view of what a steamboat is. Often they have giant water wheels that propel them forward, the old 1800s style steamboats, and some of which are still around and used for tourists. But to be honest, the vast majority of boats of this era were using steam power. It was completely normal. Because of how good steam power could be utilized, many things like ironclads also use steam power, but we never really called them steamboats, even though they technically are, in terms of what they use to propel themselves forward. I mean, even one of the most famous ships in history, the Titanic, was driven by steam engines, but you'd never call that a steamboat, but it was. So why do we have this weird language issue? Well, the reason is that early on, you couldn't use steam power for these larger boats like the Titanic. It was only after steam power became more efficient and reliable that they began using it on that larger scale. Early on, pretty much every boat that utilized steam power would have been something like the Sultana, or even smaller. So the term steamboat just became associated with this particular type of riverboat look, when in reality steam power was used very prevalently when it came to ships overall. There's also the term steamships, which is generally used for larger ocean craft sometimes, but it's rarer. At that point you just call them ocean liners or something, or there are other names that we associate with them. It doesn't really matter. The point is that this is what we call a classic steamboat. The Sultana was a side-wheel steamboat, which, well, the reason for that should be really, really apparent. The paddle wheels were on the side. Was there any advantage to having the wheels on the sides? Well, it was generally down to maneuverability. It is a riverboat, after all. And in certain situations, they were actually able to maneuver the wheels in different directions to turn, quite literally on a dime, in order to make it easier to move the boat around. Stern wheelers, as you've probably also seen, are generally more efficient though, as their wheels can be much larger, the hulls don't have to be as wide to take on the side wheels, and they usually can deliver a bit more power because of their larger paddles overall. The point was, the Sultana was a side-wheeler, very maneuverable. She was also made of wood, constructed in 1863 by the John Lithberry Boatyard in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was intended for the lower Mississippi cotton trade, however this was 1863 and this was like smack dab in the middle of the United States Civil War. She ran a regular route between St. Louis and New Orleans for 2 years and was often commissioned to carry troops. However, the accident in question did not happen until after the war ended, in fact, just a few weeks after the official surrender of the Confederate Army. The Sultana had started her voyage from St. Louis on April 13, 1865, and she was bound for New Orleans. During the trip south, she would dock at Vicksburg, Mississippi. At this point, the captain of the ship, James Cass Mason, was approached by Captain Reuben Hatch, who was the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg. See, since the war ended, the South still had a bunch of Union POWs. In accordance with the surrender agreement, these prisoners had to be released and sent back home. Additionally, the US government would pay roughly $2.75 per enlisted man and $8 per officer to any steamboat captain who took these prisoners back north. Reuben Hatch suggested he could guarantee Mason a full load of about 1,400 prisoners if Mason would agree to give him a kickback. Mason was in need of money at this time and quickly agreed to the offer. The Sultana reached New Orleans without an issue, dropping off the passengers that were on board and picked up a new load of about 70 cabin and deck passengers, as well as a small amount of livestock. She also carried a crew of about 85 at the time. On her way back, one of Sultana's 4 boilers actually sprang a leak. She had to operate under reduced pressure and made it to Vicksburg to get the boiler repaired. The mechanic took a look at the boiler issue and determined that they had to cut out and replace a ruptured seam. Captain Mason knew that this job would take a few days and cost him his precious load of prisoners, and by that I mean his money. So he and his chief engineer, Nathan Wintrigger, convinced the mechanic to make a temporary repair, only hammering back the bulged boiler plate and then riveting a patch of lesser thickness over the seam. Instead of taking a few days, it only took 1, but this type of repair is not necessarily recommended. I mean, sure, it'll hold it, but you still have to be careful because it's under pressure. Once the repair was done, the Sultana then took on its new passengers. As well as the paying ones, it also had the prisoners. However, due to a little bit of a mix-up that may have something to do with some bribery going on, resulted in the Union officer in charge of the loading, Captain George Augustus Williams, to place every man at the parole camp on board the Sultana instead. He thought the number was less than 1,500, which still wouldn't be a great deal more than the 1,400 the captain was expecting, but at this point in the story, it's probably worth mentioning that the Sultana only had a legal carrying capacity of 376, not even close to the 1,400 the captain expected, or the 1,960 prisoners he got. Those prisoners are on top of the 22 guards from the 58th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, the 70 paying cabin passengers, and the 85 crew members, which totals out to about 2,137 people, which you may recognize as being a great deal more than 376. And this was part of the reason why this disaster was so bad. Due to how overloaded she was, people were packed into every available space, and the decks on board actually creaked and sagged under the weight of all the people, resulting in the crew supporting them with impromptu wooden beams they just stuck in place to hold them up. On top of that, there was a really bad spring flood of the Mississippi that year. The Sultana was traveling upriver and the current was unusually strong. This would have stressed the boat's engines a lot more than normal even if she was carrying her actual rated weight, but she was, again, significantly overloaded, so this just made everything even worse. She docked briefly at Memphis during her voyage, and only left behind about 200 men, as well as 120 tons of sugar, until moving further north about 7 miles north of Memphis. At around 2 a.m. on April 27, 1865, the Sultana suffered a boiler explosion. One of the 4 boilers went off. It was followed a split second later by 2 more. The explosion was up at a 45-degree angle and tore through the ship's decks, including the pilot house. Without a pilot to steer the boat, the Sultana was just drifting and burning. The explosion was so intense that it ripped most of the boat apart. The only silver lining is that a set of sturdy railings around the twin openings of the main stairway prevented the upper deck from crushing down completely onto the middle deck, giving some people a chance to escape. Otherwise, they would have been killed instantly. The smokestacks fell over, the fire spread, and the survivors had no choice but to jump into the rushing water. Additionally, I should mention that the survivors of the POW camps during the Civil War were not in good shape. A lot of these men were starved. They were in horrible physical condition and completely unable to swim. Though many would attempt it, a lot of the survivors had to cling together and wound up sinking and drowning as a result of their poor physical health. As the Sultana drifted on fire aimlessly down the Mississippi, multiple other steamships, military and civilian, began to take notice and set about searching for survivors. The first of which was the Bostana, built in 1860, and was actually on her maiden voyage after being refurbished. She arrived on the scene about 2:30 a.m. and rescued quite a few people. It's unknown exactly how many people died during this disaster. Those who weren't killed by the initial explosion had the choice of burning on the ship or jumping into the icy spring runoff in the Mississippi. Those that braved the second option, if they weren't collected in time, would die later of drowning or hypothermia. Among the victims were most of Sultana's officers, including Captain Mason. The initial death toll was set at about 1,238. However, more recent analysis by historians shows the death toll closer to 1,168. Either way, what we're looking at is not only the worst steam-related explosion in history in terms of death toll, but also the worst maritime disaster in United States history. So what caused it? Was it that quick and faulty repair job? Well, that probably didn't help, but the actual reason was likely a combination of the ship being overloaded, as well as mismanagement of, yes, the water levels in the boilers. They're always down to the water levels. Look, if you're ever operating any kind of steam, anything, please keep water in it. I really don't want you to die. The Sultana was struggling against the current, so it's not unreasonable to assume that the crew may have took steps to overstress the engines. Additionally, the fact that she was overloaded not only made her heavier and harder to push forward, but also made her top heavy. This is relevant because the Sultana's 4 boilers were actually interconnected and mounted side by side, so if the boat tipped sideways, like in a turn, it would cause the water to rush out of the high boiler and into the lower one. If the water was too low, not at all touching the high boiler at that point, it would cause hot spots to form on the boiler that, despite not having any water in it, was still exposed to fire. You may recognize this as the exact same thing that happens in a crown sheet failure in a steam locomotive. If the water isn't keeping the metal wet, it can cause the boilers to overheat. Then when the water does get back to it, it will flash instantly to steam and cause a sudden surge in pressure. And if the boiler infrastructure isn't up to it, it'll explode. And that's exactly what happened here. There are some alternative theories that suggest sabotage, but most of these have been discredited as being very unlikely. In this case, the simplest explanation is probably the correct one. They just didn't put enough water in the boilers, and that combined with the overloaded boat meant that the explosion was nearly inevitable. But it could have been avoided had they topped off the water at all times. Yeah, it would have slowed their trip a little bit, but they would have made it without a problem. But instead, they chose to play fast and loose with everything, and caused the worst maritime disaster in US history. But you may be wondering, why have you never heard of this? I mean, this is a great deal of people that died in a horrific accident, and at least if you live in the United States, you'd think more people would talk about it. But to be honest, even at the time, the disaster was relatively overlooked, and in fact no one was held accountable for the incident. Though, to be honest, the only person I can really think to blame directly would be Captain Mason. And he died. So, it really was his fault. It was his ship, his responsibility. He agreed to take on that many people. And yes, I know he was being bribed by that quartermaster, but he still chose to take it. And the quartermaster probably didn't know the limitations of the boat. It was up to the captain to be aware of that. No one was ever held accountable. And the reason for that is that just a week and a half prior to this horrific tragedy, the United States suffered another horrific tragedy. John Wilkes Booth assassinated then-President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1865. Lincoln is viewed as one of the greatest presidents in American history to this day. He was in charge during the Civil War and is responsible for not only the Union victory, but also the decision to make the Civil War about freeing the millions of slaves that the South was bitterly trying to keep. He had just recently won his new term at the presidency in a landslide victory. This was a man that many respected and adored, and his unexpected murder prompted a surge of news media covering the details of his untimely death. But as a result, the Sultana fell into a little bit of obscurity. Unless you were a resident nearby or lost someone in the accident, you probably never would have known that it even happened, even at the time. Today, there sits a memorial at the Mount Olive Baptist Church Cemetery in Knoxville, Tennessee, to those that died in the Sultana disaster. Additionally, in 2015, on the 150th anniversary of the disaster, an interim Sultana Disaster Museum was opened in Marion, Arkansas. This museum is actually only temporary until they raise enough funds to build a more permanent museum to educate people about what happened on that terrible night. And as for the remains of the Sultana herself, she wound up sinking into the Mississippi 7 hours after the accident. But she isn't actually still in the Mississippi. See, occasionally over the years, the Mississippi River has changed course, and the spot where the Sultana went down is actually no longer under the river. It's in fact 4 miles from Memphis, Tennessee. She wasn't intact when she went down, obviously, and she was made of wood, so there isn't much left of her to be found. But an archaeological expedition in 1982, led by Memphis attorney Jerry O. Potter, did uncover what little is left of her. Blackened wooden deck planks and timbers were found about 10 meters under a soybean field on the Arkansas side of the river, and one can hope that nothing like this ever happens again. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.